negative stereotype in the media of Vietnam veterans. And he did a study of, believe it or not, TV guides from 1972 to 1982, which would be 52 issues a year for 10 years, 520 issues. And in 100% of the issues of TV Guide, in one place or another, either in the program descriptions or in the movie descriptions in the back of it, there was a negative reference made to or about Vietnam veterans. Younger people can't even begin to understand how pervasive that was back in the late 70s and early 80s. The World War II generation felt like we lost our war for the first time in this country's history, that we had lost it. The anti-war people, who were in our own generation, didn't want anything to do with us. It was a pretty interesting homecoming experience. And I think in a lot of ways, it affected a lot of the Vietnam veterans as much, if not more, than the war did. If you had to go through combat, and you came home and you were told you saved your country and your countrymen from being taken over by an aggressor nation, you could get some comfort in, I did the things I had to do to save my country. If you went through those kinds of horrible experiences and were told that it was a mistake and the friends that you had lost had died for nothing, it made it real difficult to come to terms with. Over the years of being a veterans advocate, I've seen the effect of the homecoming experience on a number of veterans. In fact, in my own case, after 11 months in country, I had already signed up and been approved for a second tour with a reconnaissance unit. At that time, my reasoning was that I wanted to make a career out of the military. I would go home a Sergeant E5. If I came back on a 6-month tour with a recon unit, I would make Sergeant E6, which for somebody under 3 years was almost unheard of. I mean, that kind of thing would only occur during wartime. But if it did, I'd pretty much have a good career in the military, guaranteed.
So you signed up for a second tour?
So I signed up for a second tour. After 11 months in country, I was at a place called Patrol Base Diamond 3. The North Vietnamese, the anti-war movement was saying that Cambodia was neutral, and that Richard Nixon was invading a neutral country in Cambodia. We used to sit on the Cambodian border and watch Russian truck convoys of North Vietnamese hauling heavy artillery and supplies down to the border and staging areas where we couldn't even shoot at them. And then they would infiltrate all of the men and materials into South Vietnam. Where I was wounded was a result of an operation that had gone on for about 3 months, where we were used as sort of a bait and blocking force for large enemy units coming across the border. It had worked successfully. I have an article from the Stars and Stripes that was written at the time that said we essentially destroyed a North Vietnamese Army division over the period of 3 months, but we suffered really significant casualties. I was asked to stay in the field because there were so many new guys coming in. To have somebody that was an experienced hand was still a needed commodity at that point. When I was wounded, I went to Japan and Alaska, and we went through a whole series of hospitals to be stabilized. And at that point, they didn't even try to remove all of the shrapnel that was in you. They just tried to stop the infections from killing you and deal with the major issues. Again, that provided me with a place where the people in the military hospitals and the people in the VA hospitals and the veterans volunteers that came in supported us, certainly more than the folks who had just come home and arrived on the street. But even in the situation that I was in, when I got to a hospital in Japan, it was an Air Force hospital in northern Japan. We'd been brought there to be stabilized and go through some more surgery and then be transferred back to the States. A group of college students at an American university in Japan, and I wasn't even aware of this at the time, but apparently there were so many retirees, U.S. military retirees living in Japan that they actually had Legion and VFW posts in some of those countries, in the Philippines and Japan. And this group of American college students had gone to one of these posts and gotten keychains. I have mine right here, and it says on the back of it, "Welcome home. Your country is grateful." And they used them to get in the gate past the MPs of the hospital and said, "Look, we came to give these to the troops and welcome them home." They came in on the ward. There were 4 or 5 of them. And one young fellow walked over to my bed. At that point, I didn't have the use of either one of my arms, and the blankets were up to my shoulders, and I was laying propped up in bed. And he dropped it on the blanket in the middle of my lap and said, "We got these keychains to give you guys." And he looked at me and he said, "Did you get banged up pretty bad?" I said, "Yeah, I guess I did." And he said, "You think you deserve it?" Now, when I was a kid, I had kind of a short fuse, and a lot of times I didn't think before I acted or said something. And I thought to myself, I'm pretty heavily medicated. I must not have understood what he said. So I tried to be polite and I said, "Excuse me, I don't think I understand what you mean." And he said, "Well, after all the women and children you killed over there, don't you think you got what you deserved?" I didn't even know what to say. Somebody who had gone a few beds down and started talking to another guy the other guy had got to the point where he knew what to say and started screaming obscenities and "Get away from me" and "Get out of here." At that point, a medic who must have been 6'2" came onto the ward, grabbed the kid who was next to my bed and smacked him upside the head and said, "I told you people before, get out of here. If you come on the base again, I'm going to have you all arrested. Now get out of here." And they all scrambled out the door. It got real quiet for a while. And then somebody finally said, "I got no legs. What's going to happen when I get home?" And we really worried about having to face Americans who hated us, who could possibly believe that we were guilty of doing some wrong for having fought for our country. I became real bitter for a while and real angry, and so did a lot of other guys. There was a study done in Massachusetts when I was working down there that indicated that an awful lot, a very disproportionate amount, I don't recall the exact figures, of Vietnam veterans for our non-veteran peer age group had committed suicide in the first several years after the war. If you talk to almost any Vietnam vet or almost any civilian, they know somebody who came home from Vietnam and killed themselves. I suspect that that was much higher than the returning veteran percentage from World War II. And I suspect the reason was because of the whole homecoming experience. In 1982, when we dedicated the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, we had a parade down Constitution Ave. And I was walking down the street and there was a Gold Star mother on the sidewalk with a great big sign that said, "Thank you." And I actually broke down and cried because it occurred to me I'd been home for 13 years and that was the first time anybody said thank you to me. Thank you's not a big deal. It's something that we say to people if they open a door for us. But having spent 11 months in Vietnam fighting for my country, it took 13 years for somebody to say thank you. A lot of veterans had those kinds of experiences, and a lot of veterans still harbor anger to this day. I was one of those people for a number of years. I drank too much, I lived in isolation, I had bad nightmares, I couldn't figure out where all the anger was coming from. Another veteran, when I was living up in the woods in Bradford, New Hampshire, came and got me to come out and talk to some other veterans. It turned out there were a bunch of us living by ourselves in the woods. And we formed the first Vietnam Veterans of America chapter in New Hampshire in 1979. I'm a charter member. And